Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
Up yours, woke moralists! We'll see who cancels who!
So Jordan Peterson is someone who I pretty much have called out throughout my entire career on YouTube, although I've only done this as a full-time job for about a year and a half. And I've never liked him, and I'm happy I can look back at old videos where I'm criticising him, because back in the day, it actually wasn't as popular to attack him, especially when there wasn't really a prominent left tube, bread tube, however you want to call it. And I remember my early days on YouTube, 21, 22, criticising Jordan Peterson and just getting like so much pushback, like, you don't understand him, bro, you're too much of an idiot, all this stuff. And while I never doubted myself and doubted my criticism, this simping for Jordan Peterson, and I guess him being kind of adjacent to New Atheism or the intellectual dark web as a whole, meant that he actually was very popular in many different circles online. Conservative ones, centrist ones, maybe some more liberal ones. But increasingly, his demeanor has become, in my opinion, more aggressive, more vicious. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that most of his beliefs have changed. I won't give him that benefit of the doubt, and I won't chalk it up to health issues, because I've always believed if you like Jordan Peterson, you have to buy into wildly racist conspiracy theories about leftists, or you have to believe in bigoted views towards women. But it's clear the mask has come off, and not only the mask has come off, he seems to think he's an authority on everything now. So before, he used to kind of stick to like psychology, talking about universities, that type of thing. Although we have to remember he did become prominent through fear-mongering about trans people originally. But various things have seemed to have broken his brain and just made him go like mask off, far-right conservative. And there was actually a time where he didn't describe himself as a conservative, and people would argue he's not a conservative. With him joining the Daily Wire Plus, I think it's very hard to argue this man is not a conservative. And I wouldn't begrudge people of thinking of this guy as someone who is actually further right than a conservative. And due to this persona this guy used to have, now a lot of his fans are actually turning on him, because the Jordan Peterson who helped them clean their room and maybe gave them some advice on self-improvement has vanished into someone who is just another conservative talking head who tries to dress up pretty bog standard American conservative points in intellectual language. And in my opinion, he's just become even more unbearable and far more arrogant than he ever was. And it feels like he cannot even have a conversation with people of opposing views, as evident from his conversation with Carl Kalinske, where he was just insanely combative on pretty much everything and would refuse to basically engage with the argument, instead just focusing on semantics.
The argument is it used to be very repressed because that's very outside of the tradition and the norm and the standard, and that now we sort of let the boot off the neck a little bit.
What used to be suppressed?
The entire LGBTQ community. I mean, it was very recently we even got gay marriage in the United States.
First of all, they're not a community.
Well, you understand the point I'm making.
No, actually, neither I understand it nor you, and that's why we're delving into it. First of all, they're not a community. That's just a catchphrase. It's a buzzword.
So all of that coming up for you today. But before we go any further, please like the video. And I guess the question for the comments is, when did you first become aware of Jordan Peterson? And what was your initial impression of him? Like, did you have a positive view of him? Are you a former Jordan Peterson fan who thankfully broke away from him far before he joined the Daily Wire? Let me know down in the comments. Also, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle, on Twitter, on Instagram. The subreddit is in the description. Also, consider becoming a patron. I'm trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, the benefits of which are getting access to my Nintendo Switch friend code and the private patrons Discord server. Also, check out my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra, where I archive my live streams. I usually do twice a week. I don't think I'm going to be doing 2 next week either. Sorry about that. insane heat wave in the UK next week, going to be about 40 degrees Celsius. And before people say in the comments, oh, that's cold where I live, just remember, I live in London, has lots of pollution. Pretty much no UK houses are designed to cope with heat. Most of them are designed to keep the heat in, and most of them don't actually have air conditioning. I know for a fact no one I know has air conditioning. And where I'm recording from right now is an attic room, so I get the nice benefit of the sun heating up the entire room as well. Pray for me next week, but sorry, no live streams. Also, there is still a wasp nest in my wall. I'm still going to be holding the mic like I'm some video essayist. So I guess before we start, we should go into, I guess, the history of Jordan Peterson and his old public persona. Now, I'm very happy that baby Kavernacle, 22-year-old Kavernacle, when he was first starting off his YouTube channel, never liked Jordan Peterson. When I started my YouTube channel, I was still throwing off some of the shackles of my old liberal beliefs. So I'm glad I didn't fall for him at all. And I made videos talking about how he was blaming women for their own harassment because of them wearing makeup and high heels. I made videos talking about, is there any difference between him and an Islamic cleric, because his language is very similar to it. And of course, I spoke about things like the cultural Marxism conspiracy, which we're going to talk about in a sec, and how that was always just based in wildly racist propaganda, and he was mainstreaming this propaganda itself. But yes, proud of you, old Kavernacle, for constantly criticizing this guy, even when people thought far more positively of him.
So this is the whole culture of these intellectuals who aren't really intellectuals. They just tell people what they want to hear and get a nice fat paycheck for it.
Now, I tweeted two things recently about Jordan Peterson, which I think sum up my views towards him overall, because a lot of people will say he's descended into these hard right views. I would argue he's always had them. He's just not very polite anymore. So I tweeted the other day, Jordan Peterson was never smart and was absolutely fash adjacent when he started out. You don't make a social media career of attacking trans people and promoting the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory if you don't have far-right sympathies. Cultural Marxism is already anti-Semitic just because he didn't explicitly say the Jews instead of opting for the Frankfurt School, you know, leftist Jews who fled Germany in the 1930s. Doesn't mean what he said was ever okay, and Peterson decorating his house with USSR propaganda is telling. Anti-communism as a political ideology, not someone who just doesn't want to be a communist, is usually some brand of racism against Jews, Slavs, Asians, or Africans. Of course, you cannot like Stalin and Mao and the rest of them, but believing that the communists lost the Cold War, so they finished what the Frankfurt School started and infiltrated universities to push a subversive ideology like trans rights is bigoted, so him becoming an unhinged talking head for the Daily Wire is not surprising at all. The only actual difference to me is that he used to be calmer and less angry. I think his coma probably caused some bad psychological effects, but the substance is pretty similar. So if you're a Jordan Peterson fan who fell for this type of rhetoric, and even a former Jordan Peterson fan, you might be in denial, but you would have had to have some sort of sympathies to far-right ideologies if you like Jordan Peterson talking about this political stuff, not so much his self-help stuff. But also I believe that Jordan Peterson often entered people's mind through the self-help stuff and then indoctrinated them with this political ideology. Now, just to give you the vibe of how this guy was seen as like this rational, calm centrist, you guys remember that Channel 4 interview. Now, I can't play any of it for you because Channel 4 is pretty notorious for copyright claiming stuff, but you guys remember it, and it became viral and everyone was like, calm Jordan Peterson destroys emotional feminist. Now, here is a video. It's since been taken down by Ethan Klein because he has said, you know, what happened to you, Jordan Peterson? But they're having a friendly conversation. 2 times he came on the podcast. And they're talking about how people have become politically homeless in the current era of polarization, and also talk about his interview where he calmly dismantled the crazy feminists.
And most of the people I've talked to have been conservative. But the reason for that is they're the ones who ask me to talk. Like, I'm perfectly willing to. I actually did a talk in Vancouver about a year ago now called A Left-Wing Case for Freedom of Speech, you know, because you can make a very strong left-wing case for freedom of speech. In fact, a stronger case, I would say, in some sense, because to the degree that the left historically has genuinely been about allowing the working class a voice, which I think is classical democratic socialism, which has a very long tradition in Canada, then it's freedom of speech that's absolutely crucial for that. And so it's very straightforward matter to make a left-wing case for free speech. That's generally who makes the case for free speech.
That's one of the things I want to talk to you about. And by the way, I consider myself like a very left-leaning, classical, progressive person. And it's confusing because growing up, the left was always the party of free speech, I felt like. I always felt like I was on the right side of social issues. But as time has progressed since I finished college, more and more I feel alienated by my own like political identity.
Yeah,
and I find myself more in terms of free speech, like you said, the people on the right are the ones that invite you. And so I'm confused. I think a lot of people feel the same way who grew up like classical progressives, but feeling alienated from their own political home. I feel like I have no identity anymore. I don't know, I don't know where I stand on which party to identify with.
Well, that's exactly the same thing that Joe Rogan told me the last time I talked to him. And my brother-in-law as well is a very, very smart guy. He said like he feels that his political affiliation has moved away from him.
Ask you about the now infamous interview that I'm sure everybody's seen by
Channel
now.
4.
With Channel 4. If you guys haven't seen it, it's terrific. Give it a watch. It's just Jordan Peterson interview Channel 4. It'll show up. It's got like over 5 million views now. The reporter was extremely confrontational. And I think the clip was so powerful because how calmly and skillfully you parried each of her verbal attacks. And, well, first of all, I'm wondering, did you anticipate that interview to be conducted like that? Were you expecting that kind of combativeness?
No. I'm in a clinical situation here. I'm not in the real world. I see. So
is that
I'm a
what you
different
thought
person.
when that first happened? You're like, oh my God.
I thought, oh yes, I understand. It's like I see. I'm not where I thought I was.
Was that part of the reason why you were able to stay so cool and calm and collected?
Yeah, because I was just watching. Now, and I wasn't perfectly cool and collected either, because she did set me on edge. It was
good though.
It was
quite
it
good.
was
quite good.
It was good enough.
All things considered.
All things considered.
Yeah.
That's right. All things considered, it was good enough.
You know what? You really dominated that situation, and they owned it.
So I think it's pretty obvious to anyone watching that Jordan Peterson has changed. And like I said, in my opinion, not so much in ideology, but in temperament and willingness to have a civil conversation with people. So there you have someone who probably doesn't believe the exact same things as Jordan Peterson. And this was actually taken from my video of Ethan Klein's political evolution. But also, he even has some complimentary things to say about democratic socialism and left-wing people and free speech, and believes that at that current time, the left-wing have moved away from that, as does Ethan Klein. I would seriously disagree with that, and I would disagree with it when this interview originally went live. But I use that to show you how Jordan Peterson was seen as rational, someone who could have a calm conversation, wasn't emotional, clinically would debunk people's arguments, and was this very sane voice in politics. Again, I'd hugely disagree with that, as evident by the next clip. Here is Jordan Peterson talking about, I guess, cultural Marxism, leftism, infiltrating universities to destroy Judeo-Christian society, and this is from about the same time. Despite his public persona at the time of being rational and considerate, does this seem like a guy who's very rational? Let's have a look.
Universities have figured out how to conspire, in some sense, to pick the future pockets of the students that they're purporting to educate, and they're not educating them, they're indoctrinating them. They're not teaching them how to speak, they're not teaching them how to debate, they're not teaching them how to write, they're not introducing them to the classical wisdom of the Western Judeo-Christian tradition. And that's absolutely appalling, because that's what the bloody institution was there for to begin with, and that's what it's supposed to be doing. And so what people need to do in order to know that they should stop taking the courses is to know what it is that these courses are aiming at. So that needs to be explained. Then they need to know what language the people who teach these courses are using in order to fulfill those aims. Then they need to know how to identify the courses. Then they need to know that it's in their best interest, both, I would say, spiritually and economically, to avoid those courses and those disciplines like the plague. And then maybe we can get the disciplines that have become entirely corrupt and the ones that started that way to put themselves back together before they run themselves out of existence completely. And I might as well name a few of the disciplines that I think are particularly reprehensible to begin with. Obviously, I'm painting this with a very broad brush, and I'm not making the claim that every single person who engages in activity within all of these disciplines has been corrupted beyond comprehension by the postmodernist neo-Marxists, but it's close enough first pass approximation. So, as I said already, women's studies and all the ethnic studies and racial studies groups, man, those things have to go, and the faster they go, the better. They should have never been put... It would have been better had they never been part of the university to begin with, as far as I can tell. Sociology, that's corrupt. Anthropology, that's corrupt. English literature, that's corrupt. Maybe the worst offender are the faculties of education.
Does not seem like a very stable guy, in my opinion. I also do love how he lists off a lot of subjects related to people who actually were part of the Frankfurt School. Nothing racist about this guy's worldview. And it makes me laugh that he thinks all of these things are corrupt or have severely undermined the Judeo-Christian values of the West. And again, there's been so many videos done about how you can't be a postmodern neo-Marxist, like that just doesn't make sense. But it just shows how utterly paranoid this guy is and how people should not have taken him seriously. And that's probably the most frustrating thing about Jordan Peterson. Because of this persona he had, and maybe actually being quite calm in certain situations with interviewers who weren't really prepared to deal with him, he became very prominent, but his views are just utterly insane, and he's mainstreamed an ideology which has historically been pushed by the far right, and he's helped it enter mainstream discourse. When you can see from that clip, it seems like an angry, bitter guy who is just utterly paranoid about these things. And like I said, in my opinion, him now being a talking head for the Daily Wire shouldn't surprise anyone. When you're saying stuff like that, and that's my whole point, if you were someone who was into Jordan Peterson, if you want to believe it or not, you were influenced by far-right conspiracy theories. I've made whole videos talking about cultural Marxism, so I'm not going to spend loads of time debunking it. But let's just say the members of the Frankfurt School did have an influence on academia to a degree. Their influence has been, like, overstated massively by people like Jordan Peterson. And the belief that universities are overrun by Marxists, either students or professors, makes me laugh a lot. As someone who went to 2 universities in the UK, did a history degree at one, did an international relations master's at another, I had one Marxist professor out of, I don't even know how many, 30 plus, maybe 40 plus. The Marxist society at university was actually really small, and no one took them seriously, including myself, who thought back in the day that Marxism was unrealistic and silly. Although I thought the critiques of capitalism and international relations are pretty good, I thought the way of organising society was not relevant. And it reminds me of Brett Cooper saying she had the Communist Manifesto thrown at her head when she was at UCLA. I just do not buy, unless you live in a paranoid fantasy, that there's a significant Marxist movement in universities, especially American universities. Let's get into recent Jordan Peterson. So this whole video is mainly focusing about why his fans have turned on him. So we've kind of gone through his reputation. Now, I don't want to focus on this too much because the whole video is just him being really transphobic and dead naming Elliot Page. But because Twitter has finally introduced new terms of service about dead naming trans people, Jordan Peterson and a host of other conservatives, and as part of Jordan Peterson joining the Daily Wire, he basically railed against this in one of his first videos. And I found this bit like the most unhinged and unintentionally hilarious.
I'm not taking down that tweet or acknowledging that my tweet violated the Twitter rules. Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who. Twitter's a rat hole in the final analysis, and I have probably contributed to that while trying to use, understand, and master that horrible, toxic platform. No doubt I owe some apologies for that, and I'm trying to learn, but it's a relief in some real sense to be banned. and I regard it under the present conditions as a badge of honor.
So, yeah, unintentionally hilarious. I do respect in some sense that he acknowledges how toxic he's been on the platform. Like, absolutely unhinged, spreading medical misinformation, retweeting far-right politicians and political figures. Like, this dude seriously needs to stay off Twitter, and maybe his suspension will make him do that. And maybe he'll become more sane in the process. But like I said, his subreddit have turned on him for multiple reasons, and a lot of his fans have as well. So what I want to do now is look at the reasons why they've turned on him by looking at various posts on the subreddit. And then to end it, I want to look at a piece which went semi-viral of a former Jordan Peterson fan, maybe, you know, still a fan, laying out a very, very extensive criticism of him, which I think is pretty devastating, especially coming from someone who actually likes him. So let's get into that. So I showed you a clip from his new Daily Wire Plus show, and him actually joining the Daily Wire has outraged a lot of his fans. So here's a post today. I unsubscribed. Jordan Peterson has become a meme. He joined the Daily Wire. I might listen to his podcast on Spotify, but his YouTube videos have not been interesting lately. Gravitated towards JP because of his authenticity. We can still appreciate all he has done, but as for his legacy, I see it diminishing as he keeps doubling down on these reckless, ego-driven tirades. He got his name for being on the forefront of just causes, but seems to be trying too hard to replicate such happenings. I personally do not like the idea of him jumping in the same boat as Shapiro. His mainstream presence is merely political theatre next to the intellect of Peterson. That is not to say he isn't intelligent, but let's be honest here. One positive is the superior production value. Ultimately, it's probably too early to make any solid criticisms. So another on a why I joined the Daily Wire post. Let's see what they come up with. If it's entirely trips through the Bible and rants against the left, then I'm not interested. If they offer a forum for those who may oppose and engage with said opponents in a contentious but civil way, then I'll consider it. I would love to believe that Jordan Peterson will be a positive force in the Daily Wire and it will become a big tent that welcomes diverse range of viewpoints. Unfortunately, I expect the opposite to occur. I fear Jordan will become more and more a right-wing talking head. I hope I'm wrong about any of this, or I hope that Jordan engages in some serious self-reflection and decides to strive to find legitimate criticisms of both the right and the left, rather than supporting one tribe unquestionably over against the other. Lord help him. Why money, I money, joined money, Daily Money, Wire money. What is happening to JP? Yeah, I left the JP train a while ago. Now I'm just here because I find it funny how his fan base is starting to get really concerned. So yeah, you see people doubting him, like moving to the Daily Wire, but this is what really set them off. Now, Jordan Peterson made a video for the Daily Wire about the war in Ukraine, and it's absolutely ridiculous, and it plays into, you know, my views. He's an egomaniac who thinks speaking with authority on things means you know about them, but he really doesn't understand this war at all. And for some reason, he seems to think the American and Western culture wars about, like, trans rights and things like that contributed to Russia invading Ukraine because it wanted to keep out Western influence and, by extension, keep out the woke culture wars. So let's have a look at some of the clips. I'm going to react to it, and then I'll show you the subreddit reacting.
And are we degenerate in a profoundly threatening manner? I think the answer to that may well be yes. The idea that we are ensconced in a culture war has become a rhetorical commonplace. How serious is that war? Is it serious enough to increase the probability that Russia, say, will be motivated to invade and potentially incapacitate Ukraine merely to keep the pathological West out of that country, which is a key part of the historically Russian sphere of influence? And are not the Russians and the Hungarians and the Poles and the Indians, to a lesser degree, watching and thinking, those people have gone out of their minds? And we have, to say it again, clearly, the culture war in the West is real, and culture is losing, and Russia is part of the West. And the culture war is now truly part of why we have a war. And it's a real war. And it is certainly the case that we do not, therefore, have all the moral high ground, for some part of the reasons that Mearsheimer details, and for these reasons of insanity. In fact, how much of it we have at all is something rightly subject to the most serious debate. And so the Russians believe that they have a moral duty, and that they have the highest moral duty to oppose the degenerate ideas, philosophy, theology of the West. And there's something about that that is not wrong.
So I don't even know where you start with all of that. I guess I'll start with the part I somewhat agree with for completely different reasons. Yeah, the West and America don't have the moral high ground on Russia. That's something I firmly believe as someone who's an anti-capitalist and sees the US as my main enemy in the entire world. Condemning Russia for war and stuff is all well and good. But at the same time, the US has conducted 2 brutal wars in the last 20 years. In the entire post-war period, it has killed more people than any other country on Earth. Clearly the most destructive country in the post-war period, one of the most evil countries in the post-war period. Yes, it doesn't have a moral high ground on Russia for that reason. But if you're going to ask me about the social values of, I guess, Western liberals versus, I don't know, the Russian government, I would say maybe like Western leftists or general like social views in the West are better than Russia generally. Yeah, but I'll agree with the point that, yeah, America doesn't have moral high ground on Russia. I completely reject the point. The reason it doesn't have that moral high ground is because the West is one of the better places to be in the LGBT community. There's generally more social progressivism, which was fought for by left-wing people to become normalized with great sacrifice. So I'm very grateful to the people who came before us, who did fight a very conservative West to make sure that people, marginalized groups and the rest of it could have some degree of rights and a good life, although that fight is not over and we're actually probably going in the opposite direction right now. And on that note, if Russia is a country that's fighting a war because it doesn't want to be influenced by the West, I don't know why it would target Ukraine. Ukraine, a country where the government has openly recognized far-right militias from World War II as heroes to Ukraine. A country where the government adopted the far-right Azov regiment into their own National Guard. A country that literally banned communism, apparently is the target of Russia because Russia doesn't want to become woke, essentially. How ridiculous is that? Wouldn't you think that Russia would maybe ally with Ukraine so they both wouldn't have to become woke? A completely ridiculous and insane understanding of why this war has even happened in the first place, completely not talking about Putin's own ultra-nationalist ideology in regards to Ukraine, and of course, to a lesser extent, the role of NATO since the breakup of the Soviet Union in the rising tensions between Ukraine and Russia. No, Russia did it all because Russia wants to fight the woke West and doesn't want to become woke itself, so it targeted the country where the government officially recognizes far-right militias as heroes of Ukraine's history, allies itself with Azov, and literally bans communism. Very, very woke indeed, Ukraine. And obviously, as someone who doesn't support the Ukrainian state at all, but recognise the right to the Ukrainian people to self-defense from oppression, there's no way on earth I'm gonna make ridiculous excuses for Russia's brutal occupation of certain parts of Ukraine. And I would say there's actually a lot of leftists who feel the same way as me, and we never saw Ukraine as part of like the road to leftism or wokeism. A lot of conservatives and liberals absolutely love the Ukrainian state and think it's the best democracy that ever existed. I don't know how this really fits in with Jordan Peterson's worldview. But moving on from that, this is where the subreddit completely turned on him because, yes, most people, left-wing people like myself, liberals who support Ukraine, conservatives who support Ukraine, think what Jordan Peterson is saying is absolutely ridiculous. So the first thing I want to read, what a tool Jordan Peterson has become. As an Eastern European, please think about how this situation affects Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Poles and Ukrainians. If Russia's sphere of influence should be respected, that means you reject the right of those nations' self-determination. No one cares about an American culture war in Eastern Europe. Why is he even talking about black women being considered candidates for some jury and his tweets about it? This debate doesn't exist over here, and trying to connect it to the war with Russia is beyond ridiculous. For God's sake, Poland has a conservative government Jordan would love, but they are extremely hawkish on Russia. The recent ramblings by Jordan is extremely hurtful, and I hope people will not go easy on the criticism just because he wrote a popular self-help book. Peterson is so consumed by the Western culture wars that he can't see the difference between a Russian missile and a college kid with pronouns. Sad. Seriously, this dude's completely lost it. A lot of intellectuals and academic types think that because they're experts in one field, they can suddenly jump into another. Sadly, the culture war has consumed many people's mind and turned them insane to the point where they become counter to what they believe in. I've seen this happen with so many people from various backgrounds. He's out of his element. Why does Jordan Peterson think he's a foreign policy expert? This video was sadly the turning point for me. The man has completely lost it. His takes on this issue are just plain ridiculous and low-key propaganda. Same here, his old stuff is still good, but this is the line. Something very fishy is going on with him. He's just not that brilliant nor insightful. For a little while he managed to rap telling people what they wanted to hear and some fairly generic life advice, but underneath he was always this guy, someone who takes little time to understand nuances but is very sure his initial gut reaction was right. Bro, this man really blamed wokeness for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm just, what a take. Blows my mind that people take this guy's political takes seriously. Stick to the psychology, leave the geopolitical analysis to the people who know a thing or two. So I like one of those comments which echoes what I said earlier, like Jordan Peterson thinks he's an authority on geopolitics and international relations. And as someone who's done a master's degree in international relations himself, even I am not like extremely confident on everything to do with every international relations issue. Yeah, like I did stuff like Russia and Crimea as part of my degree, but I don't keep up to date with everything to do with these things day to day. So when like the war actually started, although I had my opinions and my takes and everything like that, I didn't have an expert view on what was going on right then or the last couple like years, because I hadn't been keeping up to date with it through reading academic journals and everything. Jordan Peterson has probably never read anything properly about the region or about what has been going on in the region for the last, I don't know, 20 or 30 years. Like that thing said, it's just the gut reaction he has and trying to project some ideological agenda on something that has absolutely nothing to do with a Western culture war where the right constantly manufacture things to get outraged at. So with all that said, there's one more thing I want to read to people, and it's this article by a former fan of Jordan Peterson. And although I don't agree with all of it, I do think it's interesting to see how his own fans are waking up to, I guess, his grift or how much he's changed. So I have never heard of this before, but it's from something called Rebel Wisdom, and an article by Rebel Wisdom and David Fuller, What Happened to Jordan Peterson? In short, the tragedy for those of us who valued his contribution is that over time he's become more and more of a caricature that the worst of the media coverage always said he was. While some of the reasons for this are entirely understandable related to his ill health, for me, his current disposition and reduction to a political culture warrior risk contaminating much of his legacy and value to the conversation. The current incarnation of Peterson for me is unrecognizable from the man I interviewed in 2017. However, I must ask if I misjudged him back then, given he was already a controversial figure for many. Many of his critics on the left will say that he hasn't changed and he was always a toxic figure. Yep, I'd agree with that. My view is that there were always multiple different Petersons cohabiting in the same time, the thoughtful scholar and the academic alongside the reactive political cultural warrior. I was definitely selective in seeing the best version of him. Over time, the latter became more and more rewarded and prominent until it became the dominant persona. How and why that has happened to Peterson and to many other public intellectuals is one of the major problems of our social media age. Peterson does not embody his philosophy. In fact, his actions are in direct contradiction with so many of its core tenets. Most clearly, there is a serious lack of personal responsibility. Just in the time I've been considering this piece, his public behaviour has been getting more and more erratic, with multiple outbursts on Twitter that verge on the personal attacks, pledges to leave or reduce his use of Twitter that lasts mere hours before returning to more compulsive tweeting, with a recent tweet that Twitter judged to break their terms of service. Since Peterson has returned from his health crisis, he and the family have been very careful to frame his experience as drug dependency and not an addiction. He has an incredible number of personal crises to deal with over the last years. One of the most powerful and passionate criticisms I have heard from people close to him is his refusal to admit and deal with his addictions, and it's a contradiction of his fundamental message of personal responsibility and is a dangerous message of denial to send out to addicts. That is, the public acceptance of his personal addiction and journey to health would have been of huge value to others. Another person I spoke to a while ago who was very close to the IDW action over the last years met Peterson in 2017 and recognized the addictive personality and predicted a major public implosion. So I found that article interesting, and I find the angle about personal responsibility interesting because I've always said that about Jordan Peterson, is that he frames a lot of things to do with people's like addictions as a personal issue, and it's like your fault essentially. There's no systemic issues, there's no like family issues, religious issues. It's all on you and only you can change it, while himself suffering from addiction issues that he seems like he won't actually address, and a lot of things he won't actually take any accountability for. Seems like he's always just been a massive hypocrite. And it's funny, a guy who knows him and is close enough to like message him and his family is saying all this stuff as well. And I did find the part interesting about how Peterson has always had like two sides to him, like this reactionary political persona and the academic. Although I would say, personally, I've never really seen much of a difference. The only difference I've seen is on camera in, I guess, a podcast setting. He could be very calm and reasonable, where often in a setting which he controlled, like you saw with that clip of him lecturing, he seems to be more unhinged and more emotional about things. Of course, this is a guy who can't stop crying about nearly everything. So I thought this video was interesting to show you that finally Peterson fans are waking up to the reality, and hopefully a lot of them are realizing that they need to reassess some of their own prejudices and bigotry for even listening to him in the first place. I'm not really talking about the self-help stuff here. I'm talking about his political views, which have always been very, very similar to what they are now. He's just felt more emboldened by his right-wing fans and his use on conservative media to just go mask off with the bigotry and not really care about even dancing around the issue and pretending it's some sort of fight against, I don't know, authoritarianism. He's just making up conspiracy theories now, and it's clear even things like the pandemic severely radicalized this guy even further to just not even bother with pretending he isn't a hateful bigot. So that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.